In September 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared to be nearing its end. Paris had been liberated, German forces were retreating. Allied commanders believed the enemy was broken, running out of fuel, manpower, and time. And yet, beneath this optimism, something far more dangerous was taking shape. Because while the Allies believed Germany was collapsing, Germany was preparing, quietly, desperately, and with more strength than anyone wanted to admit. What followed would become one of the most ambitious military gambles of Second World War. A plan so bold it promised to end the war by Christmas, and so flawed it would unravel in full view of the world. This was Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault ever attempted. A gamble built on speed, surprise, and absolute confidence. And a disaster born from arrogance, ignored warnings, and battlefield chaos. By the late summer of 1944, Allied forces had surged across France faster than expected. German defenses had cracked under relentless pressure. Entire enemy divisions had collapsed. To many senior commanders, the path into Germany now seemed open. But there was a problem. The Allies were advancing too fast for their own supply lines. Fuel, ammunition, and food were stretched thin. Every mile east made logistics more fragile. Meanwhile, the German army, though battered, was falling back toward its own borders, shortening its supply routes and stiffening its resistance. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower favored a broad front advance, slow, steady, and methodical. He wanted to push everywhere, denying the Germans any chance to regroup. But not everyone agreed. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a different vision. He believed the war could be ended with one decisive thrust, a single, narrow coup d'arrêt straight into the heart of Germany. Montgomery proposed an audacious plan: seize a series of key bridges deep inside the Netherlands using airborne troops, then race armored forces along a single road to cross the Rhine River. Once across, the Allies would bypass Germany's strongest defenses, enter the industrial Ruhr, and shatter the German war economy. The war, Montgomery insisted, could be over in months. To many, it sounded brilliant. To others, it sounded reckless. The operation would be split into two parts. Market was the airborne phase. Over 30,000 paratroopers from the United States, Britain, and Poland would drop behind enemy lines, capturing bridges over rivers and canals, stretching nearly 60 miles. Garden was the ground phase. British armor would surge up a narrow highway, later known as Hell's Highway, linking the captured bridges and driving straight into Germany. If everything worked perfectly, the Allies would cross the Rhine at Arnhem. If anything failed, the entire plan would collapse. What made the operation so dangerous was not just its scale, but its margin for error. Every bridge had to be captured intact. Every drop zone had to be secure. Every hour of delay increased the risk of German counterattack. And the most dangerous bridge of all lay at the far end of the corridor. Arnhem. Intelligence reports had quietly warned that German armored units, battle-hardened SS Panzer divisions, were refitting near the city. These warnings came from resistance fighters, aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted communications. But they conflicted with what commanders wanted to believe. The prevailing assumption was that German forces in the area were weak, disorganized, and incapable of serious resistance. Many intelligence officers who raised concerns were overruled or dismissed. The operation moved forward. On September 17, 1944, the skies over the Netherlands filled with aircraft. Thousands of transport planes and gliders roared overhead. Paratroopers jumped into history, confident, determined, unaware of how quickly the plan was already beginning to unravel. Some drop zones were miles from their objectives. Some radios failed almost immediately. German troops reacted faster than expected. And at Arnhem, British paratroopers descended into an environment far more dangerous than they had been led to believe. The warning signs were already there. But by the time they became impossible to ignore, it was too late to turn back. As parachutes collapsed across Dutch fields and gliders, slammed into improvised landing zones, confusion set in almost immediately. Operation Market had begun, but not as planned. American airborne divisions dropped near Eindhoven and Nijmegen. Their objectives were critical bridges over canals and rivers that armored forces would need to cross. Some landings went smoothly, others did not. Units were scattered, equipment was lost, radios failed on impact or simply refused to work. Communication, essential to an operation this complex, was already breaking down. British airborne forces faced an even greater challenge. The 1st British Airborne Division was tasked with the most dangerous mission of all: capture the Rhine Bridge at Arnhem and hold it until ground forces arrived. But their drop zones were positioned miles away from the bridge, chosen out of concern for anti-aircraft fire and terrain suitability. This decision would later prove critical. As British paratroopers advanced toward Arnhem, they began encountering unexpected resistance. German patrols, armored vehicles, units moving with speed and coordination. These were not scattered remnants of a defeated army. They were elements of the IISS Panzer Corps, experienced, well-equipped, and dangerously close to full strength. Inside German headquarters, commanders reacted with urgency. The airborne landings were shocking, but not paralyzing. German officers quickly realized what the Allies were attempting. If the bridge at Arnhem fell and was held, the war in the West could be lost. Everything now depended on stopping that final crossing. At Arnhem, a single British battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost managed to reach the north end of the bridge. Against mounting resistance, they dug in, expecting relief within 2 days. Relief that never came. Elsewhere, British units attempting to reinforce Frost were slowed by German roadblocks, ambushes, and increasing armor. Radio contact between units was unreliable or non-existent. Orders were delayed, misunderstood, or never received at all. What they didn't realize was how isolated they already were. Meanwhile, the ground phase, Operation Garden, was encountering its own problems. British armored columns advanced along a narrow elevated road, flanked by marshland and open fields. The route offered no room for maneuver. Any disabled vehicle could block the entire advance. German forces quickly exploited this vulnerability. Roadblocks appeared, bridges were destroyed, anti-tank guns targeted the lead vehicles. German counterattacks repeatedly cut the highway, forcing delays that rippled forward toward Arnhem. Each hour lost was catastrophic. At Nijmegen, American paratroopers faced a heavily defended bridge over the Vaal River. Initial attempts to seize it failed. German defenders held firm. The delay threatened the entire timetable. Finally, in one of the most courageous and costly assaults of the war, American troops crossed the river in small boats under direct fire. Many never made it across, but the bridge was captured. It was a victory, and it came far too late. By the time armored forces crossed at Nijmegen, British paratroopers at Arnhem were already fighting for survival. German artillery pounded their positions, tanks closed in from multiple directions, ammunition ran low, casualties mounted, attempts to resupply by air largely failed, supplies falling into German hands or landing far from friendly positions. The promise of a quick relief had vanished. Instead of a lightning advance, Market Garden had become a series of isolated battles, each draining strength from the next. The operation was still officially underway, but the outcome was already being decided. At Arnhem, the bridge remained contested. The corridor was fragile, and the dream of ending the war by Christmas was slipping away with every passing hour. By the 3rd day of Operation Market Garden, the illusion of control had vanished. At Arnhem, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion was fighting in isolation. Surrounded by German armor and infantry, cut off from reinforcement, and running dangerously low on ammunition, the British paratroopers clung to the northern end of the Rhine Bridge. They had been told to hold for 48 hours. That deadline passed in a storm of artillery fire and burning buildings. German commanders, now fully aware of the Allied plan, focused their efforts with ruthless efficiency. Tanks rolled into firing positions. Heavy guns pounded British strongpoints at point-blank range. Houses sheltering paratroopers collapsed one by one. Medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded men lay untreated. Water was scarce. Radio contact with higher command had almost entirely failed. Still, Frost's men held. What they didn't know was that relief forces were nowhere near them. The British XXX Corps, spearheading the ground advance, was struggling forward at a crawl. The single road north was constantly cut by German counterattacks. Each delay forced engineers to repair bridges under fire, while infantry cleared enemy positions from both sides of the highway. The plan demanded speed. The battlefield delivered resistance. At best, the armored column advanced a few miles a day. South of Arnhem, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division fought desperately to break through to the bridge, but German armor had sealed off approach routes. Every attempt to advance ended in heavy losses. The British paratroopers were now scattered into isolated pockets, surrounded and under constant attack. Overhead, Allied aircraft continued to drop supplies, but with drop zones overrun, much of it landed in enemy hands. German troops watched Allied food, ammunition, and medical kits drift down into their positions. It was a cruel reversal. Meanwhile, Polish airborne troops were dropped south of the Rhine in a last-ditch effort to reinforce Arnhem. But strong currents, enemy fire, and a lack of boats turned the crossing into chaos. Many drowned, others were cut down before reaching the far bank. The reinforcement failed. At the bridge, Frost's position finally collapsed. After days of continuous fighting, survivors, wounded, exhausted, and out of ammunition, were forced to surrender. The Rhine crossing remained firmly in German hands. The final objective of Operation Market Garden was lost. But the cost was still rising. With Arnhem effectively unreachable, Allied commanders faced a grim decision: continue the operation and risk annihilation of the remaining airborne forces, or pull back and admit failure. The order came quietly. The survivors of the British 1st Airborne Division were to withdraw. Under cover of darkness and driving rain, small groups attempted to slip past German lines and cross the Rhine in boats. Many were captured, some were killed, a fraction escaped. Out of more than 10,000 men who had landed near Arnhem, fewer than a quarter made it back. Operation Market Garden was over. It had not shortened the war. It had not crossed the Rhine. And it had not broken Germany's ability to fight. Instead, it had exposed the danger of overconfidence at the highest levels of command. The failure was not due to a single mistake, but a chain of decisions: ignored intelligence, unrealistic timetables, fragile logistics, and an unwavering belief that the enemy was already beaten. Germany would fight on for 8 more months. And for the men who fought at Arnhem, those months were paid for in blood. In the weeks after Operation Market Garden collapsed, Allied commanders were forced to confront a painful reality. The war in Europe was far from over. Publicly, the operation was described as a partial success. Bridges had been taken, territory had been gained, but privately many understood the truth. The gamble to end the war early had failed, and it had failed at enormous cost. More than 17,000 Allied casualties were suffered during Market Garden. Entire airborne units were shattered. The British 1st Airborne Division ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its survivors were withdrawn, rebuilt, and never again deployed in the same role. Arnhem became a symbol, not of victory, but of ambition outrunning reality. The strategic consequences were severe. The Allies remained west of the Rhine, delaying the final invasion of Germany. German forces used the time to regroup, reinforce defenses, and prepare for one last major counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. In that sense, Market Garden did not just fail. It indirectly prolonged the war. Historians would later debate who was responsible. Some blamed Montgomery's insistence on a narrow thrust. Others pointed to Eisenhower's approval of a plan that relied on perfect execution. Intelligence failures, especially the dismissal of reports about German armor near Arnhem, became a central focus. What is clear is that Market Garden exposed a dangerous mindset. By September 1944, Allied leaders had begun to believe their own momentum guaranteed success. The enemy was assumed to be collapsing. Risks were minimized. Warnings were softened or ignored. The operation demanded flawless coordination across air and ground forces, across nations, across miles of hostile territory. War rarely rewards perfection. Yet within the failure, lessons were learned. The importance of secure supply lines, the danger of narrow advances, the limits of airborne operations against prepared armor. These lessons would shape the final campaigns into Germany and help ensure victory in 1945. For the soldiers who jumped into the Netherlands, these lessons came at an unbearable price. At Arnhem, civilians later buried Allied dead in gardens and churchyards. Survivors carried the memory of abandoned bridges and unanswered radio calls for the rest of their lives. One British officer would later describe the operation with brutal simplicity. A bridge too far. Operation Market Garden remains one of the most studied failures of Second World War, not because it lacked courage, but because it revealed how even overwhelming strength can be undone by miscalculation. The war would be won, but not that autumn, and not by shortcuts,